St. Eulalia's hospice didn't creak because it was old. It creaked because it remembered. Nurse Miriam Voss knew the difference. She'd worked enough graveyard shifts to learn which noises came from faulty vents and which ones came from people who weren't on the chart anymore. The building had strange architecture, too many doors for its square footage, closets that led nowhere, and 6 long hallways forming a crooked hexagon, or as Miriam called it, the wheel. Every shift began the same way. Temperature check, door alarms, morphine count. Then she'd unclip her lanyard, tuck her keys in her front pocket, and take the west hallway first. Always west. Tonight, a fresh intake was scheduled. She hated intakes. They always came in after sundown, when the families had finished their crying and handed over DNR forms like dinner napkins. Miriam would pretend to care, nod in all the right places, offer tea she never made. Then she'd check the file, assign a number, and wait. 1 intake, 1 outtake, she murmured like a mantra. No one died at St. Eulalia's without her knowing first. The new patient was a woman, no name given, admitted from an unnamed regional facility. Dementia diagnosis, stage 4. That meant babbling, wandering, and if Miriam was lucky, no idea who she was. The gurney arrived at 8:12 p.m., wheeled in by a silent young porter who smelled of cheap cigarettes and bleach. Miriam signed the intake sheet and didn't bother asking questions. The woman on the stretcher stared at the ceiling, smiling faintly. Her eyes didn't blink. "You're lucky," Miriam said as she adjusted the chart. "Most people don't make it to this wing until they're already soup." The woman twitched. A whisper, soft, raspy, unintelligible, spilled from her lips. Miriam leaned in, frowning. 6 bells, the patient said. Then she was silent again. Miriam assigned her to room 6. It was mostly unused. Some staff said it smelled like vinegar and wet paper. Others said the call bell rang at odd hours, always flashing red, never making a sound. She liked room 6. It was predictable. By midnight, the halls were still. The windows remained open. She didn't like reflections. And the walls made their usual groaning complaints as if straining against the weight of all they'd seen. That's when the call light blinked. Red. Silent. Room 6. Miriam didn't hurry. She walked the corridor slow, her shoes barely touching the faded lino tiles. The soft hum of dying fluorescent bulbs buzzed above. She stepped inside. The woman was upright in bed, eyes closed, hands folded over her lap. The sheet was tucked so tightly Miriam didn't think she could have moved on her own. But the light still blinked. Miriam checked the call button. Unplugged. The woman opened her eyes. "They never paid, you know," she said. Miriam froze. Her throat tightened. "What did you say?" "They left before the 6th bell. That's why the house remembers." Miriam took a step closer. The woman's eyes were wrong, not wide with fear or confusion, but too steady, too knowing, like she was taking inventory of Miriam. She reached for the morphine drip. Her hands didn't shake. They never did. The woman smiled. "You think you've kept your records clean," she said. "But someone always writes in the margins." Miriam didn't reply. She adjusted the dosage manually, not lethal, not enough to raise alarms. Just a heavy quiet. As she turned to leave, she glanced at the room's call light panel. It blinked twice more, red then off. That wasn't possible. It should have stayed solid red until reset. She looked back. The woman's eyes were closed again, but now her mouth was slightly open, murmuring. Miriam didn't need to hear the words to know what they were. 6 bells. She'd heard it before, long ago, from a patient who shouldn't have been able to speak, and again in a dream where all the beds were empty and the call lights blinked like pulse monitors. And now it was back. She turned off the light and closed the door. Back at her desk, she opened her old black binder, the one she never let the day staff see. Inside were names, some crossed out, some not yet. She flipped to the last page. Room 6 now had a name, written in her neat, angular script. Intake 113, Bell Watcher. Miriam underlined it twice. Her hands didn't shake, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. At 2:47 a.m., the hospice hallways felt utterly still. Even the rusted radiators ceased their rattling. Miriam sat alone at the nurse's station, her fingers gently tracing the grooves on the spine of her black binder. It was older than most of the equipment in the building, stitched with care and fastened by a brass clasp that no longer locked, not that it needed to. No one touched her book. She flipped to the page she'd updated earlier. Intake 113, Bell Watcher. A name she made up. She always did. It helped her categorize. They were never their real names. Real names left stains. The entry below it remained blank. Outtake pending. She tapped her pen against the empty slot. The whisper in room 6 hadn't been a fluke. There'd been others. Not as coherent, not as pointed, but all circling the same phrase. 6 bells. Miriam leaned back in her chair and let her eyes close for just a second. Just enough to see the old dream begin to return. She was standing at the center of the wheel, the 6 crooked corridors forming a hexagon. Every door was open. No beds inside. Only shoes. Row upon row of neatly placed, mismatched shoes, all pointing toward her. From each room, a single note rang out, low and metallic, the clang of a distant bell. 1, 2, 3. She woke with a start. 3:08 a.m. A low whine echoed from the west hallway, not quite a bell. More like a pipe singing under strain. Miriam stood. She knew that sound. Someone had opened the lockbox. The hospice had many boxes. Medical. Maintenance. Emergency narcotics. But that box, the one tucked behind the rusted water heater near the old laundry chute, wasn't supposed to exist. She'd found it her second year, after a patient named Harold Fenn kept wandering there during episodes. "She wants the key," he would mumble. "But she's got the lock. Ain't that the trick of it?" The box was thick iron, padlocked twice. No hinges on the outside, just a small etched engraving on the front. "Pay as you go." She hadn't opened it since, but she knew what was inside. At least, she thought she did. The laundry chute closet door was open when she reached it. Miriam scanned the hallway. Empty. Lights buzzed overhead like insects. She stepped inside. The lockbox was there, untouched, but something rested atop it now. Her breath caught. A small bundle wrapped in yellowed linen, folded precisely, too precisely. She crouched, slowly lifting the edge. Inside, a set of false teeth, a wedding ring, a dog-eared photograph of a boy with a jack-o'-lantern smile. Each item was tagged with the same handwriting, neat and almost antique in style. Bell too paid. She nearly dropped them. Miriam backed out of the closet and shut the door. She didn't bother locking it. Back at the nurse's station, she opened her binder again. Her hands trembled now. The bell watcher's page remained unchanged, but a line had been scrawled at the bottom in the same antique hand from the tags. "You took more than your share, Nurse Voss. 1 bell's already tolled." Her mouth went dry. She'd always kept a clean record, even when the old patients faded faster than they should, even when meds were miscalculated. That's what the ledger was for, to balance what the official files could not. Now someone, or something, was writing in her margins. The west hallway light flickered. Miriam stood again, slower this time, and checked her pen light. At the far end of the corridor, room SIX's door was ajar. Again. She didn't recall leaving it open. She approached, her steps echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. Inside, the woman, the bell watcher, was asleep, breathing softly, but her hands were different now. They were pressed together in the shape of a bell, and under her pillow, just visible, something glowed faintly green. Not light, not heat. Accountancy. Miriam stepped back into the hallway. Someone was keeping books, and she of all people knew what it meant when the debts began to call in interest. The next day passed in something like a trance. Sunlight never really touched St. Eulalia's. It lingered, filtered through yellowed curtains, fading like an old photograph. Miriam went through the motions: medications, sponge baths, gentle lies whispered to waiting daughters. No one asked about the binder. No one ever did. But Miriam couldn't stop glancing at it. When she flipped to the bell watcher's page after her shift, the antique scrawl had vanished. Completely. Except the number at the top of the page had changed. Intake 113 was now 113 to 2 bells pending. Miriam left early that evening and took the long way home. Not because she needed fresh air, she hated fresh air, but because she remembered something. There had once been another nurse who carried a similar ledger. Her name was Ada Voss, her grandmother. The surname wasn't coincidence. Family had whispered about Ada in tones normally reserved for ancient curses or unpaid debts. She had worked in dying places, the kind of care homes that folded when too many bed sheets turned red. Miriam had once found an old photo of her. Same eyes, same expression, same black binder clutched in her arms. That night, Miriam dreamed she was in room 12. But room 12 had been sealed off since the fire. It smelled of varnish and spoiled honey. The walls were too smooth, like something had licked them clean. She walked toward the bed, but the closer she got, the further it seemed. Gravity tilted. Space turned soft. There was someone in the bed, or something. She couldn't see its face, but it had her hands. She reached forward. The bell rang, loud iron rod wet somehow, and her eyes snapped open. 3:21 a.m. At the end of the hallway, room 12's door was open. That door had been sealed since 1996. Miriam stood up, her feet heavier than before. She walked, binder in hand, past sleeping patients and humming fluorescents. The door to room 12 groaned wider as she approached, as if eager. Inside was empty. No bed, no dresser, just a low wooden stool in the center of the room, and on it a metal bell. It was tarnished and cracked, but something about it felt awake. A hum in the air, a tension beneath the floorboards. Miriam crouched beside it, carved into the bell's rim, barely visible. Pain and sound. She stood too fast. Behind her, the door slammed shut. She turned, no one there. A whisper, dry as old paper. 3 left, Miriam. She didn't recognize the voice, but the binder in her hands did. It pulsed. She opened it. A new name had been added, this one in her handwriting, though she didn't remember writing it. Intake 114, Julian Thorne, 1 bell pending. Julian, one of her regulars. Hadn't died. Not even close. Not yet. Miriam shut the book and left room 12 without another glance at the bell. Her skin felt clammy, her ears hot. She could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, somewhere behind her, but she didn't turn around. If she turned around, the bell might toll again. Back at the nurse's station, she sat and stared into nothing. The whispers had begun again. They didn't come from the halls or the intercoms. They came from the ducts, from the drains. They were getting louder. One repeated the same sentence over and over. I never owed her. I never owed her. I never owed her. The next one simply said, don't let her balance the book. She opened her ledger one more time. Now there were 2 extra lines at the bottom. Intake 113 to 2 bells pending. Intake 114 to 1 bell pending. Nurse Voss, 1 bell tolled. Nurse Voss, 5 bells pending. She read it 5 times. Nurse Voss. Not Ada. Herself. Someone was counting her down. And if she didn't find out how to stop the ringing, she wouldn't just hear the next bell. She'd be inside it. The next shift started with static. The intercom crackled and popped, as if someone were pressing the call button and releasing it again. No voice. No alert. Just a rhythmic click, like a clock that had forgotten how to tick. Miriam stared at the screen, showing the hallway cams. Room 12's feed was dead, just black. That room didn't have power. She knew that. She'd order the circuit pulled herself. Still, the black square flickered every few seconds, almost like someone was breathing in front of the lens. She tried to focus on the living. Julian Thorne, intake 114, sat in the solarium, petting a therapy cat. His mouth moved soundlessly, mumbling to no one in particular. When she approached, he stopped and smiled. Do you know what a death promissory is, Nurse Voss? he asked. Miriam froze. She hadn't told anyone her grandmother's name. Julian's smile faltered. Wait, you're not her, are you? You look like her, but... He trailed off. Then he looked at the hallway behind her and paled. Miriam turned. No one there. When she turned back, Julian's face had changed. The smile was gone. The light, too. His head slumped forward, and he whispered, "One bell left." She grabbed his wrist. Pulse, erratic but alive. He hadn't died. Not yet. Back at the desk, she opened the ledger. It no longer needed a pen. It wrote itself. Julian Thorne's line had been updated. One bell tolled. Beneath that, a new entry appeared in real time. Room 9, pending. She stood. Room 9 was Mrs. Danvers, dementia, nonverbal 94. A sweet, whisper-thin woman who smelled like soap and fennel. When Miriam entered the room, the curtains were moving as though someone had just left, though the window was sealed shut. Mrs. Danvers stared at her with perfect lucidity. "I don't want to go, Nurse Voss. I never signed her book." Miriam stepped closer. "Who?" "The one behind you." She spun around, nothing. But the smell of candle wax hung in the air. When she turned back, Mrs. Danvers had curled into herself. Silent. Ashen. A chime echoed in the room. Not mechanical. Ceremonial. She checked the monitor. Flatline. But no one had died. Her paperwork said Mrs. Danvers was already DNR. Still, 2 bells tolled. In the break room, she found the binder open on the table, though she'd locked it in her locker. A post-it note sat beside it, old and yellowed. "You will owe 2, child. The bell is never wrong. A.V." She tore the note in half. The pieces reassembled themselves on the binder cover. She threw it away. It returned to her lap an hour later. She tried calling out sick. Her phone dialed before she touched it. When she answered, her own voice replied, "Miriam Voss. 3 bells remain." She smashed the phone. It didn't break, it breathed. That night, she returned to room 12. The stool was gone. In its place, a small, iron-bound chest, sealed with melted wax. A note attached to the lid. For collection. Inside was a bell, this one silver, smaller, and a list of names, including her own. The column beside her read, 4 paid, 3 owed. Miriam no longer heard the whispers at 3 a.m. They began at 2:59 now. She'd gone from listener to ledger keeper. The hospice wasn't a place to die. It was a place where death kept receipts, and Miriam was now its most careful accountant. There were only 2 patients left. Harriet Lorne, 88, once a jazz pianist, now catatonic, and Thomas Everly, 76, still sharp, always reading, polite to a fault. Miriam watched them through the observation window, ledger open on her lap. 3 bells tolled. Balance. 2 names owed. 1 bell remains. The wax-sealed bell sat beside her now. She hadn't touched it. Didn't need to. It rang itself. That night, Everly approached her desk without a sound. He looked over the counter. His eyes weren't just tired, they were ancient. "You've taken up her post, I see." Miriam said nothing. Not many last 5 tolls, let alone 6. She blinked. "I didn't." "You don't need to ring it, Nurse Voss. It rings for you." Then he smiled kindly. "You still think it's about the patients." That shook her. Miriam reviewed the book. Harriet's name still hadn't changed. But beneath her own name, a new column had appeared. 5 collected, 1 owed, and the page flickered, just like the monitor feed in room 12. She turned the page. It was filled with her own handwriting. Pages and pages of names she didn't remember writing. People she'd known. People she'd stepped over. A neighbor from childhood. A schoolmate who died young. Her old lab partner. Her mother. Each with a word beside it. Owed. That night, Harriet Lorne passed quietly. Peacefully. A smile on her face. The bell did not ring. But Miriam felt a pressure behind her eyes, like a headache made of sound. The ledger updated. Total, 6. You remain. When she returned to the staff office, the walls were covered in maps. Not drawings, impressions. Like something had leaned against the plaster and left behind routes. Each map showed the same hallway, the same hospice, but twisted. Stretched. Rooms where no doors should be. Bells that didn't stop ringing. In the center, room 0. She'd never heard of room 0. She tried calling Dr. Weber. No answer. She pulled the fire plan from the wall. No room 0. But the next night, she found it anyway. Down a hallway that didn't exist the day before. A door she didn't open, but found herself inside of. Room 0 was a mirror. Only it didn't reflect her, it showed her ledger. Pages and pages of debts. Not debts. Debts. "Who do you owe?" whispered a voice. Miriam turned. There was no one there, but in the chair sat her grandmother, knitting in silence. When she looked again, it was her father. Then her old professor. Then herself. Older. Wiser. Gone. The room asked again, "Who do you owe?" She fled. The hospice lights buzzed louder. Every corridor led back to room 0. Eventually, she gave in. She stepped back inside, sat across from herself, and opened the ledger. And for the first time, there were no new names. Just a bell. The silver bell was in her hand. It had melted, or was melting, into her palm. The voice, now familiar, whispered, "You've taken the seat. It's yours now. You're the bookkeeper." And across the page, "Balance settled." When morning came, Dr. Weber found her in the nurse's lounge. Eyes open, breathing steady, ledger nowhere in sight. "I must have fallen asleep," she lied. But the break room clock ticked 3:59, and the intercom clicked once, no voice. She smiled faintly. 6 bells only. No more, no less. Until the next keeper forgot what she'd promised.